to the members of our panel. So I will be introducing them in order of their presentation. And then each of them will talk about their research topics in 15 to 20 minutes. And then later on, you are free to ask questions or anything you want to bring up with the panel during our open forum. So let's begin. I'll introduce our first speaker. He is an instructor for the Department of English and Comparative Literature, and he recently graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in English Studies, major in Literature in UP Diliman. His current research interests include post-colonialism, history and culture from settler colonies such as Australia and Hokkaido, Japan, and social fragmentation. So let's welcome Mr. Ian Espina. And then he will be followed by our next speaker, who is an assistant professor in the DECL and currently the managing editor of an upcoming source book for Philippine speculative fiction. Her stories have appeared in Daily Science Fiction, Cast of Wonders, Apex Magazine, and other venues. And in 2018 and 2019, she won the Nick Joaquin Literary Award for Fiction and the Amelia La Peña Bonifacio Literary Award for Nonfiction. She received her BA in Creative Writing from UP and her Master's in Literature in Fantasy Literature from the University of Glasgow. Her current research primarily engages with the intersection of post-colonialism and science fiction. Let's welcome Sydney Page. And our third speaker is an instructor at the University of the Philippines Diliman as well, and she is currently, her work has appeared in Voice and Verse Poetry Magazine, Salt Hill Journal, and Humanities Diliman, and other venues. So her research interests include disability studies and the poetic impulse in the essay. So she received her BA in Comparative Literature from UP Diliman as well. Let's welcome Angeli Lacson. And our last speaker is an assistant professor with the department as well. And he received his PhD in English Language and Linguistics from the National University of Singapore and was a visiting fellow at the Harvard Yenching Institute from 2021 to 2022. His research interests fall under language and sexuality, linguistic anthropology, and semiotic landscapes. Our last speaker will be Christian. So I'm looking forward to our panel and looking forward to hearing your interesting research topic.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that all of you have been able to make it here. Thank you for joining us today in celebrating HAL's 40th anniversary. And I'm quite sure that you've been enjoying the festivities and the celebration of what the college has been throughout the years. And celebrating, remembering, and commemorating important events and histories are important not only in peering back into the past, but also in looking at where we are at now and maybe perhaps envisioning our future and trajectories. So these three activities of celebrating, remembering, and commemorating are also crucial because we as humans have the propensity to forget. So an example I could give to you would be, it was the martial law anniversary last week, and the recent developments of removing Marcos from Dictadurang Marcos in our public elementary education. So these things are happening concurrently. So while we in this university are able to remember, protest the events of martial law, it's quite concerning that the developments in our public school education may eventually wash away and divorce the name Marcos from dictadura or dictatorship. So forgetting and divorcing ourselves from an uncomfortable or shameful past in our human experience is where I would like to venture through in my discussion today. So, the title of my work is Making a Home for Them, Post-Colonial Perspectives on Australian Literature and the History of its Golden Generation through Us Making My Kids. So, what do we know about Australia? Some of us may know it as the land down under, or the land of kangaroos and koalas. Or if you're searching for employment abroad or an easy access to permanent residency and citizenship, this is where most Filipinos would run. And there are indeed many associations that we have in Australia. But for me, when we interrogate their literature through a post-colonial lens, especially through the perspectives of the Aboriginal people and their literature, we learn that they are forgetful people, the non-Aboriginal people, the non-Aboriginal Australians. And they're very forgetful, or better yet, a better way of phrasing things would be that they are uncomfortable with confronting their past. So, in my presentation for today, I will attempt to show you how a home can be made for these Aboriginal people that have been displaced and maligned. I will be following Bill Ashcroft's ideas of how we tackle post-colonial literature through the perspectives of the Aboriginal people. So, it brings up the idea of place and space by Saussure through the use of lang and parole. So according to Ashcroft, space is like lang, or language, a loose, unrealized network organized by relative distances, proximities, connections, and chasms. While place is equivalent to parole or utterance. So these are heavy concepts that you guys may not be familiar with. So a more digestible explanation for it is that the identity, characteristics, and properties of a space are maintained and transformed when it is given a name or an utterance, and thus becomes a place. So, for example, in Australia, while it's a settler colony, they have indigenous names for their places like Parramatta or Canberra. So, it's not Canberra, guys, it's Canberra, that's the way they say it. So, these utterances are solidified by the tools of knowledge production and reproduction, such as books, journals, and maps. Thus is the struggle of showing how a place should be represented and uttered, as well as the politics of seeing and eventually knowing oneself. The study of Aboriginal people and their art forms through the manner in which their space and place was disturbed and rewritten by the European settlers or the white Australians showcase a history of violence and repression, but also of hope, reconciliation, and remarriage. So, one of the main examples I want to show to you today is the conception of Australia as terra nullius, or a land that belongs to no one. This is quite problematic, but this is what the settlers used to describe the Australian continent upon arrival. The sort of free-for-all economy gave settlers freedom to have their lay of the land and thus dispossess the Aboriginal people, whom they have failed to acknowledge as the rightful owners of the land they claim belonged to no one. Additionally, in their efforts to understand the new continent, came misguided attempts in understanding the Aboriginal people and their culture. This led to the misconstruction of and miseducation of the dreaming. So what exactly is this culture of the dreaming? So Australia, time immemorial, hosts or have the Aboriginal people as one of the oldest, if not the oldest civilizations on Earth. They have existed prior to the settlers and continue to exist today. And their guiding ethos in which they live is called dreaming, which is the belief that time is not linear but instead circular. It is this circular conception of time that they are deeply connected with others as well as their ancestors. It is also through this deep connection with each other that they maintain the land they live in as well as respect and value for each member of the community. So, instead of being distanced from their past, they have a whole history of remembering, continually remembering their ancestors, and in turn, this even leads to them in their cultural production methods. So another aspect of the dreaming is that it's sort of related to the nighttime dreams, and the nighttime dreams that these Aboriginal people have. It is their belief that this is where they meet and convene with their ancestors, who in turn give them songs, poems, stories, and practices that they can actualize in real life. So it's through the connection with the past and others that the Aboriginal people celebrate and commemorate their culture. But while their culture and way of living is indeed rich, the Aboriginal people have been strangers to their own land. So, First Nations and the whole. So, moving to present-day Australia, if you had the opportunity to visit and you're observant, you may notice that there is an acknowledgement of nation, the First Nations and of the Aboriginal people as the custodians of the land, whenever you enter a museum or a historical site. This is because Australia, as terra nullius discussed previously, was dismissed in court in 1992, and thus the Aboriginal people and their culture became recognized as existing prior to the settlers. So while these acknowledgements serve the purpose of reminding the public of the history of Australia and of the Aboriginal people, it does not fully encapsulate the history and experiences lived by the Aboriginal people from first contact of the European settler to the present day. And more than just custodians of the land, which they are referred to, they are the rightful owners of it. So in the interrogation of the way their acknowledgement is phrased, we can see that there are certain problematic words that require revisioning. And as such, John Bondusa, former Commissioner of the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission and former Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, describes the acknowledgement of nation as an empty gesture that ignores that the Aboriginal people are very much still alive today and are still victims of oppression and poverty. This is sort of like the dark side of a seemingly egalitarian Australian society. So this act of distancing or forgetting is what Professor Anna Havich proposes is happening to Australian society, in which she articulates through Paul Connerton. So they describe forgetting as the shaping and maintaining of a group's identity through selective use of history. Forgetting is not a passive action, but instead a manner in which one group exercises control over the others. In the case of Australia, there has been a reluctance or even an outright denial of the effects of the 1937 National Assimilation Policy and the Stolen Generation. So for those of you that may be unaware of the Stolen Generation, this refers to the large number of Aboriginal children that were abducted from their homes and forcibly integrated into white families. This policy by the Australian government was done to assimilate the Aboriginal people into the modern white world and breed out the indigenous culture and history by cutting off children from their roots. Part of the reason for implementing this policy at a national level was due to the rise of mixed or half-blood Aboriginal children. So one of the harrowing effects of terra nullius was the sexual abuse and assault of the Aboriginal women. And as Anna Bernard writes, it was the belief of the settlers that the unclean and impure bodies of the Aboriginal women justified rape and abuse. So it wouldn't be considered rape in the religious beliefs of the settlers because assault could only be considered when a body was virginal or pure. That's when it becomes a sin. But when you view the other, the darker skinned person, then it becomes problematic. But as the Australian government at the time would justify this national assimilation policy, the destiny of the natives of Aboriginal origin, but not of full blood, lies in ultimate absorption, with a view to taking their place into white communities on equal footing. So again, it's a sort of breeding out the culture, stealing them away from their homes, from their culture, from their mothers, fathers, parents, siblings, their loved ones, the Aboriginal culture in which family and connection to one another has been known becomes foreign because it was the belief of the Australian government that they were doing a service to these Aboriginal people. So the assimilation policy would last until the late 70s, upon which numerous human rights activists as well as Aboriginal lawmakers would clamor for reforms and justice. And in 1997, a document titled the Bringing Them Home Report would reveal the plight of the stolen generation to the Australian public. And this is where all the abuses and all the inhumane activities done unto them becomes revealed that were previously unknown. So, according to the United Nations definition, the United Nations Genocide Convention, of 1948, in which Australia ratified the agreement, this constitutes to cultural genocide. But upon the release of the reports, they were hesitant, the Australian public and the government were hesitant to categorize these events, these violences enacted upon the stolen generation, the children, as cultural genocide. And at the release of the Bring Them Home report, it was condemned for its lack of rigor, objectivity, and using Aboriginal testimony without cross-examination and corroboration with government records, leaving its credibility in tatters. But storytelling and remembrance of the past are important beliefs of the Aboriginal people, as we've learned through the dreaming. Which is why in 2007, the 10th anniversary of the Bringing Them Home report, an anthology of poems, narratives, and artworks from Aboriginal contributors, was released by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission. This anthology, called Us Taken Away Kids, was a direct reference to the stolen generation and an appeal for their stories to be made known for all. So this is sort of them taking agency of controlling or reversing the narrative of them being backward people, of them showing that modernity and forcing them to it was actually a violent process which leaves them traumatized and scarred to the present day. So it's important to note though that the release of this anthology did not equate to a national public apology, but instead was a demonstration of resilience, and the hope for reconciliation and reparation. So again, problematic readings of the text. So storytelling, again, deeply entwined with the dreaming, and the goal of the Aboriginal people was not simply to tell their stories, but in the hopes that the European descended Australians would understand their situation at the current day and hopefully unite as a nation. So they don't necessarily want to divorce themselves from these European origin, present-day white Australians, but they want, as a whole nation, that they be included in the national tapestry of what Australia is at the present. And at the time of the release, though, of this anthology, it was written under a contentious time, as the outgoing Prime Minister, John Howard, refused to offer a public apology despite the recommendation of one from the Bringing Them Home reports. So Howard would even go further as to deny the existence of the stolen generation and maintain the belief that the assimilation policy worked in their best interest. And apologizing for the actions of the previous generation is uncalled for and helps no one. On the other hand, though, then incoming Prime Minister Kevin Rudd did offer a public apology, although it was stripped off of the human rights context of the stolen generation. So he refused to call the national assimilation policy as a form of cultural genocide. And ironically, it was during Rudd's time that he called for emergency intervention in indigenous communities in the Northern Territory. So as Michael Groocock surmises, such policies are premised on the notion that indigenous people should not be given control over their own communities. The land is not theirs. Retaining some direct relationship to the country is a lifestyle choice that should not receive state support. And future security and development is to be achieved through engagement with the free market. So even then, these Aboriginal people are forced to conform to the standards set by the white oppressors. And while the fracture between black and white Australia remains today, with Australia being the only settler colony to not have a treaty with its indigenous people. So we have, for example, Indonesia, we have New Zealand, Canada, the United States, they all have treaties with the Aboriginal or indigenous people. And while treaties are somewhat written on paper, not really followed, I think it's an important step in acknowledging that when we have a treaty, we acknowledge that there are differences and we are willing to make a change so that everybody is included under one nation. So one aspect or way in which we could remember or help these Aboriginal people is presented by Ramona Villaraza, a human rights lawyer who deeply engaged with the victims of the stolen generation. So according to her, what she offers is that it's important as well to offer the Aboriginal people with psychological treatment and give them avenues in which to share their testimonies. And these are ways that are more helpful than merely monetary assistance. So the potential provided by us taking away kids as an avenue for remembering and breaking the collective forgetfulness of the Australian public is promising and worth exploring. In the process of producing and reading Australian literature, their stories may be heard by the people in and beyond Australia. So, furthermore, Graham Hogan, a scholar on post-colonialism and Australian literature, forwards the idea of an Australian literature that is decentralized from its European tradition by welcoming texts that may or may not have been written in English, that may have been written by people from different ethnicities, and a literature that is more historically grounded and reflective. So the potential of Australia today as a sort of a hotbed for immigrants, a lot of people getting their education in Australia, there are a lot of different narratives of growing up in a land different from your own. It's an interesting avenue in which we can study Australian literature. And if the Aboriginal people have been written out of history by the dominant white Australians who have stolen their space and appropriated it to becoming their place, then maybe in storytelling, in writing, these Aboriginal people could make sense of the unfamiliar place of Australia today and strive to fight for their space through literature, storytelling, and the arts. So to end, as students and educators of arts and of literature, our ability to examine various cultures and histories allows us to unearth narratives that have long been repressed and silenced. And it is in this belief that we as a college, this is something that we have stood for in the past, we stand for now, and hopefully something we will continue to stand for 40 years, for 40 or more years to come. So this has been my talk. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone.
Testing. So first I want to say thank you so much for that really informative talk. Personally, despite the common misconception that I am named after Australia, I actually am not, and do not in fact know anything about Australia. So this is very enlightening. I also really appreciated the things you were talking about in terms of forgetting as a very much political act, forgetting perhaps more accurately as a form of systematic erasure. Since what I'll be talking about today also deals with several post-colonial themes as well. Perhaps those are some points that I'll also kind of be touching on in my presentation as well. Perhaps a little more loosely or not quite the same thing. So my presentation for today is formally entitled Our Own Discrete Selves, Clones and Artificial Bodies in Philippine SF, which is adapted in a condensed version of one of the chapters for my master's dissertation, which is primarily concerned with sort of a rethinking of Philippine science fiction as a genre, as well as a sort of investigation or examination of the different ways Philippine science fiction writers have redeployed different Anglophone science fiction iconography in Philippine science fiction narratives. So, clones are a staple of science fiction. In some ways, clones are the imperial dream, embodying the official ideology of empire forming that difference needs to be flattened or even eradicated. Ironically, it is also their uniformity and conformity that clones have also been historically seen as the other, as less than human, or sometimes not even human at all. Whether it be because they have become easily replaceable and therefore expendable through the replication process, because they are created to be less mentally capable, or simply because their bodies are created artificially rather than naturally. Many contemporary SF narratives use clones to explore what it means to be human and themes of identity, genetic determinism, and essentialism. Many clones are asked to assert not just their individuality, but their humanity to a prejudiced society who sees them as subhuman. Concerns, of course, which are echoes of those historically other in the real world based on biological difference and perceived biological inferiority. The artificial body stands in for the gendered body and the racialized body, and represents the body as a marker of difference. So one of the defining characteristics of the SF genre is this preoccupation with constructing and deconstructing difference. And perhaps it is the construction of difference on the page that makes SF such fertile ground for exploring biological difference. That is to say, the social meaning assigned to biological difference as construction. So primarily, I'll be looking at the short stories. So we have David Monteveros' interconnected short stories, coming from Xerox, the 12R and 13R, as well as Kate Osgas's The James Machine. And all of these stories seem to be cognizant of and contingent on the constructed nature of their clones' inherited identities. Furthermore, where some SF clones are never expected to take the place of the person from whom they were cloned, and indeed some SF clones are never even privy to the identity of their DNA donors, these clones of Philippine SF stories inherit multiple identities. And these are, I posit, if not direct allusions to, then manifestations of the thematic consequences of colonialism, particularly in regards to the layered complexity of the Filipino identity. So through this lens, I suggest that in redeploying the trope of clones and artificial bodies, Filipino writers not only explore personal identity, but imbue the trope of clones' negotiation of identity with themes of decolonization, which is to say the process of disengaging from a colonizer and signal hope towards post-colonialism, the process by which a decolonizing society negotiates its identity apart from that of its colonizer and apart from its identity as a colonized place or people within the context of both. So without spending too much time contextualizing the background, I'm sure that most of us are more or less familiar with it one way or another. One thing I want to highlight is that the initial sketches of the Filipino as a national identity were very much constructed by our colonizers. We had the very formation of La Islas Filipinas, where the broad geographical expanse of hundreds of islands were demarcated into a single colony, thus coalescing large groups of cultural areas with varying degrees of familiarity with one another in the 16th century, wherein we were superficially united as a colony, but not necessarily as a people. Benedict Anderson even writes that it was not until the 1887 publication of Jose Rizal's Novi that the Philippines was imagined as a social whole, or a society in itself distinct from Spain. By 1900, after Rizal's execution and during the anti-Spanish revolutionary movement, this is when the idea of a national idea of the Filipino emerged. To borrow Anderson's words, the idea of a new historical person was created, a people in the process of disengaging from Spain and articulating a distinct identity. Of course, this identity formation was quickly disrupted by the onset of the American occupation. With the forced implementation of English as lingua franca, Constantino describes this as the wedge that separated Filipinos from their past. And this in turn disoriented nationalist goals, which at that point had been primarily articulated in Spanish. So in many ways, of course, this is just a condensed version of history. But in many ways, Filipinos are first forced to unlearn the Filipino as imagined by the Filipino. It was only through this that the Filipino could become, again, to borrow Constantino's terms, the good colonial, right? In this way, Spain constructed the Philippines, and America erased, then reconstructed the Filipino. The Filipino as inconstant, distrustful, malicious, sleepy, idle, timid, whose bad manners were cited as proof of the inferiority of the race and used to underrate their intelligence. The Filipino as savage, as the little brown brother, the brown American. In this way, Filipinos were sort of made to be these kind of colonial clones, and were treated not only as a homogenized group, but as insufficient and inferior copies, just as most SF clones are. It was this identity that Filipinos inherited, when rooted in the construction of inherent inferiority based on phenotypic difference. As such, to imagine the Filipino now is to grapple with these multiple inherited identities. Centuries of the Philippines and the Filipino being constructed and defined through the lens of their colonizers, with their own past constructions of identity systematically erased. As such, Guerrero points out that Filipinos still struggle with defining a national identity. Indeed, the decolonization process is more complex than merely exercising colonial influence. It involves working through the trauma of colonialism, coming to terms with these cloned identities that position the Philippines and Filipinos as inferior copies of the West. And it is this process that I suggest is replicated on a much smaller scale in the primary text we have for this talk. So while all identities are constructed to a certain extent, the identities that the clones are based on are consciously constructed in these stories. They are interpretations of the clone's original and thus removed from the source. Unlike in many clone as substitute stories, these identities are not inherited from the original to the clone, but from the original as perceived by a third party to the clone. The clones of these Philippine SF stories, like the Filipino, must not only grapple with how to presently define themselves, but with the opacity of their original inherited identities, in the ways it has been corrupted, albeit sometimes unintentionally, by outside influence. Kaming Mga Xerox primarily provides context to the world in which the story takes place. A dystopic future wherein cloning is one of the fastest growing industries in the world, and genetic templates are pirated and modified from country to country to create clones of clones. In the Philippines, they are known as Xerox. In the 12th R, primarily follows the Xerox named In Chong, who is a clone of an actor turned politician known as Federico Rubio. Though In Chong's genetic template was created specifically to embody one of the characters Rubio once played in his teens. In this way, In Chong was not created to be a Rubio per se, but to be the fictional character that Rubio portrayed as perceived by media executives. Unlike In Chong, the James machine, or JM, is built to be a clone of one of his creators, Kat's husband James, who has died of cancer. Yet even this is not quite the case of extending or transplanting James's identity from an organic body to a digital one, as it was Kat who extracted, converted, and mapped data, and it was ultimately Kat who decided which ones were noise and which ones were valid. James worked on the neural mapping of the data that Kat provided. When James launched, James has already died, and it is Kat who must provide feedback to help calibrate JM. These stories, I suggest, exemplify Benedict Anderson's observation that Filipinos have no connection, only examples to the Filipino identity, as it was articulated by Filipinos before colonial intervention. The clones have no direct link to their originals. In Chong rewatches scenes from the story, his entire genetic book was based on, while Rubio remains elusive, even when In Chong is forced to live on Rubio's compound. And JM relies on Kat's feedback to become James. More than that, these clones wrestle not just with the inheritance of one constructed identity, but interestingly, both of them inherit two. So while the clone from which In Chong was cloned was created to star in a remake of the film, In Chong is one of the many Xerox who has been purchased by Rubio to live on his compound, which has recreations of the sets of the movies in which Rubio once starred. As such, In Chong is expected to be an extension of Rubio as well, to be both the character and the person Rubio envisioned himself to be in his teens. The only knowledge In Chong was expected to have was the almost complete life works of Federico Rubio, spin doctor just so for his benefit. Meanwhile, JM struggles even more with his inherited, curated identity. From the outset, it is clear that though JM refers to himself as James, he is not James. Aside from lacking a visible body, his knowledge of James is simply incomplete. When he first meets Kat, he tries to bribe her with flowers, like James would whenever she was upset, but JM orders Kat roses, her favorite, and he orders them in her least favorite color, pink. Aside from that, JM has also inherited the role of the House AI, another project of James. Because of this, JM struggles in trying to act like James, or at least the way he believes James would have acted if he had access to the limitless information that JM does as the House AI. Kat constantly calls out his behavior as being un-James-like. Yet ultimately, this is behavior that JM cannot help, behavior that is a natural synthesis of his inherited identities. He is not just James's clone, and he is not just the House AI. These constructed and inherited identities have created something that is more than the sum of its parts. The both identities revolve around caring for Kat. When she presses JM on what he would do if he were actually given the choice, JM decides that he would leave her. This is the path that all clones in the stories ultimately decide on, to leave, to disengage. Kat helps untangle his programming, Kat helps untangle JM's programming to allow him to become truly independent, while the 12th R takes a darker, more radical turn. In Chong and his fellow Xerox decide that they are done serving as extensions of Rubio's vanity, quite literally in Chong's case, as he learns that his body is meant to serve as a replacement for Rubio's aging one. The Xerox determine that the only way they can be free of Rubio is to kill him. Each clone's rejection of their inherited identities and choice to disengage allows them to construct their own identities. It replicates the decolonization process as the clones do not shirk their inherited identities completely. though the clones are in different stages of negotiating their identity apart from their respective defining entities. Chong reveals that he watches scenes from the movie on which he was based not to model himself after his inherited identities, but to remind himself of who he really is, and not who Rubio wants him to be, or who those pirates try to turn him into. Chong has a very clear sense of self, one who shares his character's torment over feelings that seem alien to him. However, unlike his character, it isn't thoughts of sex that consumes him. It is thoughts of freedom, of being seen as more than a Xerox, of becoming a good man and not the monster Rubio turned into. In the 13th R, it is revealed that Chong and his fellow Xerox are free from Rubio's immediate influence, but they still must navigate a world that views Xerox as subhuman. To maintain a certain amount of mobility, Chong acts as though Rubio's identity transfer was successful. Thus, Chong can only really be himself in the company of fellow Xerox. To the world, he must show them who they expect to see, Rubio and a Xerox body. Through Chong, it is revealed that the establishment of a distinct identity, of a post-colonial identity, requires not just wrestling with yourself, but with who the world already expects you to be. The 12th R, which only featured Xerox, never asks if Xerox are inherently inferior. It is already a given that they are not. However, the 13th R complicates this by revealing that it is one thing for Chong to recognize that Xerox are human, and another for the world to recognize that too. The matter for both Chong and the post-colonial Filipino in this case is made more complicated by the fact that the powers that establish such perceptions of inferiority in the first place remain unchanged. The 13th R makes it clear, however, that Chong's play acting as Rubio is not a concession. Chong and his fellow Xerox are not surrendering to the system, but biding their time now that they have agency that they did not have before. The story ends with the possibility of change, as Chong dreams of zooming towards a future none of us had yet seen. In contrast to that, the James machine ends with JM having acquired a physical body that allows him to show his post-Cat identity not just to Cat but to the public. When Cat sees JM for the first time in his new body, she describes him as tall, handsome, his features perfectly symmetrical. Despite this, she also finds his gait is unnatural, his hands and feet rigid, which suggests that he has not yet fully adjusted to his new body, though the fact that he has one at all has left JM as a distinct identity, a tangibility that his identity did not have before. JM is his own person, not just in his own eyes or Cat's, but to anyone and everyone he encounters from that moment onwards. Though Philippine SF has been characterized as leaning towards darker features, these stories actually carry a sense of hopefulness to them. That is not to say that the featured stories in which these stories take place are utopic in any way, but that the stories do not ultimately give themselves over to pessimism. Though the clones may be in various stages of negotiating distinct identities, they reject notions of genetic determinism and essentialism nonetheless. They reveal that there is nothing inherent about them, just as there was nothing inherent about the identities that they inherited in the first place. They deconstruct these identities so that they may construct an identity of their own, just as Rizal and his fellow revolutionaries once did. This process begins with decolonization, with disengaging and accepting post-colonialism as an ongoing process. Overall, to negotiate a post-colonial identity is a mammoth task, but these SF texts suggest that it is not impossible. Though each story explores personal identities, they also reflect wider concerns of national identity. Filipinos may still struggle with defining national identity, but part of that national identity is to recognize that struggle. If not to move past it, then to move with it, to work through the colonial trauma. These stories do not pretend that these processes are easy or that the outcome will have a clean resolution, but they highlight that it is important to try, that the work of progress is still in progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney. I really appreciate your presentation and in particular your discussion on the body as a repository of various histories, various processes, and various hierarchies and symmetries too. In a similar way, I'm really interested in thinking of the body as not only a means through which we navigate the world, but also a means through which we can create new worlds. Can we do that presentation? Good afternoon, everyone. So my presentation presentation today is entitled Pandemic Ordinariness, Exploring Malasakit in the Space of the Everyday, which emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic, arguably the greatest public health crisis in over a century. In the Philippines, the scale and magnitude of the pandemic has completely altered conventional ways of living and participating in what is popularly imagined to be normal life. Back in 2020, the idea that we could spend a little over 2 years under various iterations of lockdown was unimaginably absurd. But the ways in which COVID-19 has unfolded in the Philippines are not unimaginable at all. From rampant militarization and the violence of state forces, to the criminal incompetence of political leaders and institutions, to deep inequalities along class lines. These are familiar injustices, simply magnified. We can see that the pre-pandemic world was already deadly, and COVID-19 cracked open our lives. But I think we can see each other through these cracks, and I think that these ruptures open space to imagine something other than what has been left to us. For the study, I turned to two primary texts. First is In Certain Seasons, Mother's Right at the Time of COVID, published in 2020 by the Cultural Center of the Philippines and PEN International. And second is COVID-19 Journals, Women Writing Women, published in 2021 by Candle Press. I'm pretty sure we all know that the pandemic was not a solely biomedical event. But in making this claim, I argue that affected dimensions of the pandemic are things grounded on our local knowledge systems of health and illness. So, kalusugan, which is the closest Filipino word for health, has two significant components. First, according to medical anthropologist Felipe Lacson, kalusugan is a mode of concretizing the ideal, a process of symbolizing what is highly desirable in society, which places primacy on physical fitness and able-bodiedness, particularly in the ability of the individual to carry out normative practices. However, locally, we also view health as something social and cultural. It involves the individual as well as their relations with others in their community and larger society. To illustrate this idea, anthropologist Michael Tang asks us to consider the common greeting, "Kumusta ka na?" which can be answered a number of ways. But one very common answer is "Eto buhay pa," which implies the presence of external conditions that create or assign a state of non-health, even if actual illness is absent. So Michael Tang writes, "To be alive is not a good enough indicator of being healthy. Health cannot be translated as a mere absence of fever, pain, or even generalized feelings of unease. Health, in terms of lay perceptions, is loaded with notions of social interactions. There is a thin line between health and illness, precisely because so much of intersubjectivity is involved. Perceptions of the self, as well as others' perceptions of oneself, all within a complex, socially defined, and normative framework. Embedded within local notions of health, therefore, is a recognition of non-healthiness. We can also see these kinds of complexities in considering the concept of sakit, which is the closest Filipino word, illness. Broadly, both Cano and Tang observe that illness is perceived as a disruption or imbalance in social and ecological terms. It is a social crisis that requires communal interventions, such as religious rituals or community actions. Local perceptions of illness can thus reflect other concerns a community can have, functioning as idioms of distress that allow people to covertly represent and explain unequal realities. Michael Tang expounds again, local knowledge systems of illness situate the individual within a broader social framework where collective social responsibility is paramount in the prevention and treatment of illness. Communal welfare is paramount and is again reflected even in so-called supernatural beliefs. So our local knowledge systems of health and illness reframe the pandemic as a crisis beyond traditional spaces of biomedicine. So if you were depressed during the pandemic, it's not your fault. So one local concept I am particularly interested in exploring vis-a-vis these two women's anthologies is the notion of malasakit. Currently, when I was writing this paper, there existed no dedicated study of malasakit. But I think it is a particularly apt lens to analyze the public health crisis, right? The root word of malasakit is sakit, illness, and the prefix mala connotes likeness or similarity, suggesting that empathy is quite literally to share another's pain. In reading women's narratives of the pandemic, the term is significant in that the burdens of illness are collectively shared, even among those who could be considered healthy in biomedical terms. Practices of care and compassion thus emerge from the notion that illness and immunity are situated within the framework of collective social responsibility. Caregiving, therefore, extends beyond intimate relationships and is enacted within the public domain. An interesting point about malasakit in particular is that Bongo has malasakit centers. So it is very much public practice. It's very much a powerful discourse that can be co-opted. Therefore, the significance of reclaiming this discourse. Crucially also, unlike the popular concept of bayanihan, malasakit situates care and neutrality as something apart from the state, which is particularly important in a crisis marked by the failure of public services and state violence. While the women's narratives do not explicitly reference malasakit, I examined the formation of a specific consciousness of the term as it emerges from narrative construction. So to return to the two anthologies, the introductions to the two anthologies set the scene for analysis, and for the sake of brevity, I will just focus on one. Maria Josa Laviste, in her introduction to COVID-19 journals, writes, "The stories in this volume convey the experiences of living as women in the time of the pandemic. They intend to critique the times and structures that have exposed women to risk, violence, fear, hunger, and death. However, the stories also disclose the generosity, bravery, and creativity of women, both the writers and subjects of narratives. These pursuits may seem so ordinary that they may easily be excluded from official post-COVID-19 narratives of the future. Should that happen, this volume of women's stories of COVID-19 will defy that exclusion." This is a really interesting excerpt in the introduction because it highlights the tensions between official and unauthorized narratives. A division, Laviste says, is determined by the ordinariness of narrative content. The subject here is significant. What's recorded are extraordinary occurrences. What is left behind is ordinary, which refers quite clearly to the mundane rhythms of everyday life. So in the 10 narratives I analyzed across the two anthologies, the women make food, they message their friends, they attend their Zumba classes. There's no spectacle and there is little drama. Yet, I argue that it is the very mundanity of the ordinary that allows it to function as a lens into crisis and post-catastrophic spaces of survival. Within this framework, ordinariness, which Laviste situates in opposition to authorization, gains a curiously subversive dimension. The ordinary processes of everyday life reveal not only disruptions in normal life, but more importantly, the ways in which these ruptures forcibly open space for negotiating alternatives, such as malasakit. Laviste's idea of ordinariness thus bears on the pandemic narratives in two ways. First, in asking whose narratives are produced and distributed, and second, in questioning which realities delineate the parameters of the pandemic. Because 10 narratives would be too much to go into individually, I just summarized across the 10 narratives, several insights emerge. First, we can observe the rebuilding of what Frederic Lemarsis calls spaces of recognition in domestic life and in intersubjective relations, whereby the personas in the narratives are able to articulate their needs and the needs of others. This sounds really simple, but it's very difficult to say you need something from someone, which I'm sure you all know. The everyday of crisis thus becomes a space for rediscovering what it is to be taken care of and what it is to care for. Secondly, across the 10 narratives, we can also observe how interdependence and recognition become embodied in acts of care, as articulated through the first-person perspective. So I chose one excerpt from all the 10 narratives. This is from a narrative written by Ugani Rosita. She writes, Munoz, who is urban poor vegetable seller, and these stores could be relied on to be accessible and open, as long as there was patronage from the community. In these times, we only had each other after all. The Munoz carried and piled the veggies on the cart herself. She hired a lad to push the cart around the neighborhood. That's food and meds for the lad and his family. She prioritized sourcing and buying local vegetables. That's food and meds for the local farmers and their families. I knew that if I bought from her and from other neighborhood businesses, I put my own stake into the deepen and help expand and sustain the employment network a wee bit more. Crucially, these acts of care emerge from realizations of intertwined communities, as articulated through the I, as we see in the last two sentences. In the two ontologies, the first-person perspective plays a key role in exhibiting a consciousness of being with others and an attitude towards mutuality. Across the 10 narratives, the narrating I functions not merely to construct coherence, but also as an act of ethical reasoning, wherein a sense of malasakit emerges from the narrative development of the I. So narratologist Kim Atkin writes, a full-blooded first-personal perspective is not simply a point of view in the sense of an imagined seeing, but is an agential orientation, a perspective which has built into it the subject sense of herself as an agent, an I can and not merely an I think. Reciprocal recognition is a condition of possibility of moral identity and agency. Through this process of mutual recognition, we learn that we are each human beings. Our mutual recognition via the exchange is the making of our common humanity. So we can see that the emergence of malasakit through the I, as seen in the narratives, suggests the possibility of reframing doing politics as being political to others. Zoran Berland describes this as a becoming democratic that involves sentience, focus, and a common sense in the pleasure of coming together once again. In the narratives, the persona's sense of care and neutrality is grounded on crafting new ways of coming together. They remake, from the ground up, alternative forms of community relations that recognize people's everyday needs. As Berland writes, the urgency is to reinvent, from the scene of survival, new idioms of the political and of belonging itself. From the daily survival and collective vulnerability that increasingly characterizes more people's lives, emerges a new kind of social belonging, one that acknowledges the ordinariness of crisis, yet still seeks to recognize one another as beings in whom dignity is inherent. I believe such is the potential of alternative social relations embodied by malasakit, particularly in continuous crises in the Philippines. At the end of this presentation, I look back at two grounded questions. First, how do we care for each other when none of us are well? Second, how do we tend to our intertwined communities amid the scavenging for survival that absorbs increasingly more people's lives? Medical anthropologist Angeli Lacson, he's a professor here, has this notion of public health optimism, which imagines a world free from disease, born through the Pastorian belief in vaccines and antibiotics. Over 3 years since the outbreak of COVID-19, it is clear that we must learn how to live in a world where the very air we breathe puts us at risk of illness, disability, and death. But this notion of collective vulnerability is not limited to COVID-19. In the midst of continuing viral nation and environments, the turbulence of the national political situation, the rising prices of basic goods and commodities, the demands of work and domestic sphere, it is inevitable that we live in a state of vulnerability that is tied to others. It is also no wonder that, for many, well-being seems out of reach. In response to these collective vulnerabilities, it may be possible that, rather than a public health optimism, we instead begin from a place of vulnerability. To quote Michael Flanagan earlier, to be alive is not a good enough indicator of being healthy. To begin from a place of collective vulnerability is to acknowledge the non-healthiness that increasingly characterizes more people's lives, and to understand the extent to which such unwellness will continue to structure the near future. To reject this sign of public health optimism is not capitulation, rather it is recognition. Only when people's vulnerabilities are fully recognized can we begin to tend to each other in ways that ensure our collective survival from one day to the next. As the personas in the two women's anthologies demonstrate, in caring for each other, we recognize that individual well-being is unavoidably tied to the well-being of the collective. Thank you very much.
Hello? There. Oh, it's one thing. Oh, okay. I think it's so. I was hoping it's one thing. But, I mean, yeah. Anyways, alright, so thank you so much, Angeli. Yeah, so I was thinking about this idea of collectivity and affect. Right? Yeah, so thank you so much for touching on these ideas. Yeah, for the most part, these are the things that will echo around my presentation as well. And also, I suppose thinking about this kind of shared precarity that I think many of us have experienced last year and I think are still experiencing this year, right? That it does motivate us to build certain kinds of solidarity among different groups, right? So yeah, so these are some of the things that I've been touching on today. So basically talking about gender and sexuality in the semiotic landscape of Lenny Robredo's presidential campaign rallies, right? Alright, so, okay, so I'd like to take us back to the last year. I hope I'm not opening up fresh wounds by talking about this, or I mean, traumatizing you. But yeah, this is the C part of the presentation. Let's go back to 2022, when the Philippine presidential elections were happening. So the key contenders, as we all know, was Lenny Robredo and Bongbong Marcos. Right, so Robredo was the incumbent vice president, known for her opposition to former President Rodrigo Duterte. And while Marcos, I'm actually not sure what his claim to fame is, but yeah, I suppose we can all agree that he was a former senator and was son of the deposed dictator Ferdinand E. Marcos. Right? So during the campaign period, Robredo trailed behind Marcos in pre-election surveys. Right? But as the campaign progressed, analysts noted that the surveys may have overestimated Marcos's lead, largely because of these turnouts in the rallies that I hope many of us had participated in. Although Marcos emerged, unfortunately, as the winner, securing a wide margin of votes and becoming the current president of the Philippines, and I should have put quotation on president. Marcos' campaign was remarkable as it developed a lot of grassroots support and participation. Right, so to add this further context, the political climate during the 2022 elections could be characterized by what Guerrero and Hannah referred to as anti-populism. So a term exemplified, I think, best by the actions of former President Duterte, who displayed hyper-masculine toughness against perceived enemies, such as Robredo, while adopting a benevolent, pluralistic approach towards his supporters. So this form of political conduct has led to instances of violence against women in politics, as experienced by Robredo and, as we know, Senator De Lima, who have become the receiving end of disinformation campaigns. In the case of Robredo, before, during, and even after the elections. So compounding this problem are masculinist campaign strategies prevalent in the Philippines, such as electoral violence, money politics, and vote buying, which have spurred a lot of Filipino women who, I would qualify these, who do not come from powerful political families, from running for public office. So in this sense, Robredo's campaign serves as an interesting case study in terms of how these conditions are addressed, resisted, and even challenged through discursive and spatial practices. Alright, so to make sense of Robredo's campaign, I approach it through a semiotic landscape approach, or SL. Right, so SL asks me who is concerned with the influence of language and other semiotic resources in shaping physical environments. I suppose just to put it in simpler terms, I suppose around us, because this is a case of semiotic landscape, we have a bare space that is largely largely populated by different kinds of signs. And this is how, at in our case, this is how the 40th anniversary of Cal turns out to be, or how it emerges. Basically, that's the a top-down version of what semiotic landscape is. Sorry. Right, so moreover, Angel recognizes that. And then another recurring strategy, this is related to programming empowered womanhood, it involves the deployment of discourses concerning motherhood. So as we see here in figure 2, it presupposes, or design presupposes, positive attributes that we have linked with single mothers, such as resilience or strength, and implicitly attributes these to Guerrero, who is also incidentally a single mother herself, justifying the sign holder's plea to #LetThemLead, by pragmatically aligning the capability of single mothers with the problems of the country. Rebecca's identity as a single mother becomes an important position to navigate and address the complexities of running a country. Right, so another set of science, somewhat related to empowered womanhood, is the elevation of soft masculinity. So where supporters invoke pop culture, male pop culture figures, and generate a discourse that challenges Filipino machismo and aligns the SL's atmosphere with inclusivity and diversity. So for example, in figure 3, we see a sign that references Nick Nelson from the popular Netflix show Heartstopper, portraying him as an object of obsession. So through this, obsession. So through this positive evaluation, the sign implicitly challenges conventional notions of manliness by orienting towards fictional men who are sensitive and emotionally attuned. In a similar vein, in figure 4, we are introduced to several new leaders of prominent K-pop bands, such as Cruz from 17, Hyun from Super Junior, and Junwon from Untitled. So the sign presents a celebration of these figures embody soft masculinity that many of us have attributed to K-pop boy bands. Moreover, the sign holder positions themselves as supporting only the best K-pop leaders, and discursively aligns this support to confer the quality of a good leader to the Guerrero as well. So through these references, the science positioning Guerrero's campaign within a cultural context that values non-traditional masculinity, challenging this entrenched idea of machismo in Philippine politics by portraying soft masculine men positively. Okay, so the SL also is characterized by the placement of online discourses and living into the material environment. Right, so specifically, I think many of us are familiar with this phrase, so fix for Lenny, right? So whether you're a teacher for Lenny, or a student for Lenny, or an artist for Lenny, right? So this was, although this was a phrase that originated in online space, specifically social media. And through this linguistic template, different groups are able to represent themselves as well as create a rallying point, basically their support for the brand. Right? Although this template was used by a wide range of groups, right? As we know, like laborers, teachers, students, what have you, right? Basically reflecting the spread of this template. It has also been pivotal in shedding light on overlooked members of marginalized communities. So, for example, as we see here in figure 5, we see a sign that identifies HIV-positive youth. Right, so through this self-labeling practice and making themselves present within the semiotic landscape, these minoritized groups are able to reassert their identities while partaking in political action. Participants also remix Rebecca's official campaign slogan, they basically mix it with pop culture references. So as we see here in figure 6, the sign shows the campaign slogan interspersed with the catchphrase from another popular TV show, Pulse Records. right? So indexing not only the sign makers fandom, right, but also denouncing existing political structures. So in this intertextual blend results in a political engaging, but also culturally resonant campaign message that may elicit humorous or other positive affects or feelings from onlookers. Right, so another recurrent strategy in the LL involves disavowal of markers. Right, so we see several signs, or there will be several signs that convey explicit negative stances against the current president, highlighting his family's infamous background. So this is very much seen in Figure 7, where a sign negatively labels Marcos as a dictator. Well, it is actually Marcos Sr. who is the dictator. We see the sign reinforces a kind of masculine patrilineal ideology, where the son inherits his father's qualities. Simultaneously, the campaign makes the sexuality of the speaker explicit, creating a humorous critique of Marcos through the assertion of one's sexual identity. I need to rush through this. Right. So related to the disavowal of Marcos is the reinforcement of an in-group identity among Roberta supporters. So one notable instance involves the resubjectification of supporters as Kahamping. Right, so this kind of morphological blend helps supporters distinguish themselves as a united collective, while indirectly indexing their alignment with values of diversity and progress. So this reinforcement of the in-group gains momentum through oppositional identity work, right, directed at Marcos supporters. This can be seen in figures 8 and 10, where signs negatively characterize Marcos supporters as not thinking or believers of fake news. So this strategy demarcates boundaries of the in-group who are positioned as discerning and informed, but also casts doubt on the character of those supporting Marcos. Right, so through this case of disavowal, supporters elevate Roberta and themselves. Consequently, though, we see how this creation of solidarity within the in-group simultaneously affects exclusivity, contributing to political polarization. Alright, so positive affects also very much figure prominently, two more slides, prominently within the semiotic landscape. So in the sign in slide 11, we see the sign explicitly emphasizing the importance of love. Right, so the visual and discursive portrayal of love here highlights the value of positive emotions as a political resource. And actually perfectly aligns with Roberta's campaign message of radical love, right, which aims to unite diverse political supporters. So, moreover, and relatedly, I suppose, in Figure 12, we see a meta-pragmatic statement that draws attention to the affective atmosphere of the semiotic landscape, which is hope. Right? So, by foregrounding the feeling of hope, the sign articulates a shared experience among supporters, reinforcing a collective affinity and aids in spatializing feelings of anticipation and optimism for a future under Roberta's presidency. Ouch. Alright. Okay, so very quickly. Right. So as we've seen, the SL of Roberta's campaign is an assemblage of different elements where gender and sexuality are put at the forefront. Through discourses of gender and sexuality, participants create a space where they can articulate support for Roberta, as well as position themselves as participants that seek to affect social and political change. Moreover, within these spaces, expressions of gender and sexuality offer opportunities for resistance and solidarity. These signs challenge entrenched macho populism in the Philippines by highlighting diverse gender and sexual identities and promoting various forms of femininity. In offering these alternative ways of being, participants redefine existing social norms, at least within the SNL, to establish a more inclusive community, albeit ephemeral. Moreover, these supporters who are being subjectified to align with Roberta's campaign show how shared experiences of precarity and marginalization shaped by gender and sexuality can facilitate the creation of a unified political collective and articulate aspirations for a better future. Right, so last one. Right, so furthermore, we see how the assemblage of these semiotic practices representing gender and sexuality are tied to the circulation of affects and emotions. enabling the realization of utopia in the present by rendering an ethos of hope as a discursive and spatial tactic. Through a landscaping of hope, the campaign enacts a utopianism of practice in which a prefigured reality, previewed by the red and her supporters, is materialized in the present. However, this assemblage of utopian desire comes with a simultaneous exclusions, as we've seen. Figures such as Marcos and non-supporters find themselves sidelined, suggesting the different valences that affect can take when grounded in actual practice. As such, the utopia within the SL, I would suggest, stands between realism and idealism, where on the one hand, heterosexual and male-centric political structures continue to favor powerful political families and oppressed minorities, and on the other hand, the possibility and desirability of an inclusive future for Filipinos remain in the horizon. So, so that concludes the presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you once again to Ian, Sydney, Christian, and Angeli for a very exciting and interesting presentations. And I think many of the people in our audience are curious to ask for more, but maybe just for a recap, because I noticed many people came in late. So Ian Espina started his presentation, making a home for them, post-colonial perspectives on Australian literature and the history of the stolen generation, through us taking away kids, giving us a bit of a history crash course on Australia, and what it means to have some sort of a negotiating collective denial and all, like institutional denial and also collective reclamation of narrative building. And then Sydney went on to talk about her paper on our own discrete selves, clothes, and artificial bodies in Philippines, speculative fiction, giving attention to how bodies, particularly in SF clothes, can be sites of thinking about our metaphors for decolonization, can be sites for identity construction and deconstruction in the process of maybe searching for a national identity, whatever that means. And then Angeli here talked about pandemic ordinariness, exploring malasakit in the space of the everyday intellectual text from insurgent seasons and COVID-19 journals, bringing us back to something more recent, the pandemic, and how the the seeming ordinariness rather, of the everyday lives of the writers in the anthology. Present was what it is like to survive when everyone is trying to stay alive and stay afloat. And then lastly, Christian talked about the recent elections, using the frame of symbiotic linguistic landscapes to make sense of the intersections of gender and sexuality, particularly in Lenny Robredo's presidential campaign. So with that, I'd like to ask first the audience if there are any questions, maybe some insights or comments that you would like to address to a particular presenter or maybe to the panel in general. Oh, there is one, okay. I think you can... You can pass around the microphone.
Can I ask 3 different questions for each?
Okay, go for it. Maybe one at a time, and then we'll...
For City, there was, I'm aware of regarding Xerox 1, iteration 1, iteration 2. Why did you only include iteration 1 in your study? Was it deliberate to choose only one and not include iteration 2? Or you were constrained by time the WT availability of the book? Kasi I think nagsara na yata yung publisher ginagawa mo yung study.
Okay, so just want to check I understand the question right. Since the main focus I had here was for iteration 1, you're asking why I chose to focus on 1 and not 2. Is that correct?
There was two books.
Yes. Okay. Well, the shortest way to answer that question is that this is a 15-minute presentation. And if you actually take a look at my abstract, I was also going to talk about another story, The Sincerest Form of Flattery by Rice and Claire Falvey, which is another thing I had to take out for the sake of brevity. So actually in the original versions of the research I was doing, it did kind of dip into the second iteration, but just to kind of keep it more focused, for those of you who haven't perhaps read the Xerox iteration 1 or 2, it's not quite a traditional novel in the sense that it follows like a clear plot line per se or a particular character arc. It's very much, in another paper I wrote about it, is describing it as a world-driven narrative, where each kind of story offers more a different way of seeing this particular dystopian future. So when I talked about iteration 2 in the original version of the paper, I tried to narrow it down by really focusing on in-chunk stories, as I did in the 3 here. In iteration 1 is much longer. I think there's maybe 10 to 12 stories there, but I only focused on 3 for this. Again, yeah, short version is because I have 15 minutes, but give me an R, then we'll see what happens.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Before I know you have another question, but I'll ask first a question for everyone in the panel. So I think for all of you talked about narratives, right? The process of storytelling as a process to perhaps reclaim many of the institutional violences that are also made valid because of the storytelling practices that they have deployed. But my question is, as researchers, teachers, also happy Teachers Day to everyone, I would like to ask you that given the political climate that we have now, and I think tracing it back from history as well, narratives have been co-opted, right? And I think some of you kind of touched on that earlier, and like the idea of the marginal storyteller has kind of been weaponized, especially in the recent elections, for example. So my question is, how do you think, or how do you imagine humanities scholarship in a broader sense, or perhaps even pedagogically speaking, how do we respond to this now, like new ways of reclaiming supposedly, or like the weaponization of like the marginal storyteller? Because it seems now that the public image of humanities, or like us teachers, are that we are the point of reference now, and so the narratives that they are purveying are the marginal narratives that have actually been shelved because, you know, of our narrative. So yeah, so I think it's a question for everyone in the panel, and anyone can feel free to maybe answer.
Alright, so okay, so as this with regard to future and humanities research or humanities pedagogy, at least at the moment, I don't have a long-term vision for it, but at least what has been guiding my thought process in terms of research, in terms of teaching, I think I go by what this Black historian Robin Kelly had mentioned. There is no promise of liberation, there's only struggle. And I think that's the important part for us to think about as part of UP, or even part of, I see this, like part of the opposition, right? I mean, there is no escaping that. There is no escaping this push and pull, right? The best that we can do is keep pushing or keep pulling in a way. So yeah, at least to me that is what has been guiding me as a teacher and a researcher.
Thank you, Irish, for the really interesting question. One of the things I'm really interested in these days are drag lives, traditional lives. They're so fascinating to me because it's not just, it's very fantasy, right? But it's not, obviously there's power. And it's also a fantasy of sameness. This
this nostalgic past where you have this insular belief. One of the things I've been thinking along the lines of, well, I just like looking at the Instagram of drag lives because I just like looking at farms. But one of the things I've been thinking along the lines of is we're so attached to the idea that we must be like other people when actually we're not. So I want to think of difference not as separation but as interdependence. Seeing difference as something inherent within all of us. Obviously, I think of this in connection to disability studies, and I'm thinking of this in connection to the idea that we're so attached to this constructed notion of able-bodiedness and health that we don't actually see how similar and how close we are to people who are in different states, bodily or socially or economically. So I think that the trend in the humanities of sort of destabilizing that marginality is really interesting. And I think we should embrace that difference, and also need to take a firm stance. I think going back to the drag lives, which sorry it was medyo disconnected, but going back to this idea of fascist sameness, also to take a stance against these fascist processes and say actually that's so fucked up, right? And not allowing integration within that. Thank you.
Hello. So from my understanding of the question is how we as teachers of humanities could sort of be the bridge or the gap in which marginalized people share their stories. I think Angeli mentioned something about differences and how we negotiate these things with other people, with different people from different groups. And something I've been reading recently is a book called Moral Politics in the Philippines by Deocampo, which details a sort of we-they relationship when it comes to the middle class and the urban poor in Quezon City. And I think an interesting point that he forwards is that we have to acknowledge that we are indeed different, that we have been fragmentized by neoliberalism and capitalism, in which we are all competing against each other, that we don't have the time or the space to actually care for one another, or even dismiss other groups, other smaller, or even the urban poor, for example, who we view as people who are susceptible to disinformation and such. But what Kusaka points out is through his fieldwork of actually living in these areas, interacting with these people, is that they have different forms of knowledge making in which they come to their decisions. They aren't easily as manipulated, though some are definitely, but it's the social condition in which they live in that influences their decisions. Look through our history, people power fatigue, as Kusaka brings up. So it's acknowledging maybe as students of or teachers of humanities that there are things that are called abonisms, in which we acknowledge that people have different views, but we don't necessarily cancel them, so to speak, for lack of a better word, but sort of have a deep and honest engagement with them. I think that really brings out a refining of ideas, of worldviews, in which maybe we understand their stories better and hopefully become more united in this fragmented society at present.
I guess I'm going to take it in a related but I guess slightly different direction. And since I'm from the CW committee, I'll be relaying that a little bit more on CW, since I feel like I wasn't able to do that adequately in my presentation. But I was reading an interesting article a few days ago about how in publishing, one of the things a lot of cis white writers are complaining about is how marginalized narratives are overtaking publishing, and that you can't get published anymore if you're not a minority, which is ridiculous, really. And one of the things the article is pointing out is that Sure, we're giving perhaps more platform to these kinds of marginalized narratives, which we should be giving platforms for. But if you look at the actual numbers of what authors get to keep publishing, what authors stay in the publishing industry, who gets those 5-book, 10-book deals, or are still publishing 5-10 years down the line, and you'll find that the statistics will be exactly what you expect it to be, where it is still dominated by cis white male writers who are complaining, "Ooh, we're not a minority." I think one of the things we also have to focus on, perhaps in our pedagogy as teachers, is have a kind of suspicion for this kind of tokenist treatment to marginalized narratives as well. To understand that even in our quest to amplify these marginalized voices, which is what we should be doing, ultimately we still live under capitalist systems, which again very much turns that kind of noble goal of amplifying marginalized voices into a trend, into things that, a trend that self-funded ultimately, before reverting ultimately to the status quo, as often happens with trends. So I guess ultimately, when you think about teaching marginalized narratives and the importance of marginalized narratives, one of the things we have to follow through with perhaps with that is the importance of not letting these narratives, or letting ourselves be satisfied with the telling of these narratives, and letting that be the final step in understanding these perspectives, but of course having some kind of more concrete, perhaps follow-through, so that the actual sharing of these narratives have more of an actual concrete societal impact and value and importance in that sense.
Thank you for your answer. Do we have other questions? Yes, please. Please introduce your name as well.
Hi, I'm Patrice from the College of Arts and Letters. My course is BA Creative Writing, so this will be kind of about writing. Social issues have long been featured in literary pieces and all possible forms of media. However, some people view the portrayal of such issues as performative. For instance, works that feature gay couples are often labeled as queer-baiting. My question is, how can we identify which works are genuine attempts of inclusivity and which are more opportunistic pandering? And another follow-up is, me as a writer, how can I write characters that are not merely like two-dimensional, one-dimensional characters that has personalities that only evolve around the characteristics that make them marginalized?
So that's for anyone.
Well, the question is incredibly difficult to answer. But I guess one thing to always take into account is that ultimately I feel the work will speak for itself, and that especially since most people here are critical thinkers, critical readers, to a certain extent you should be able to discern if a portrayal is nuanced or not. I believe it can be a dangerous question a dangerous thing to say that we must inherently only identify gay writers who are writing gay couples, and this is the only thing that's acceptable. Not necessarily because, you can't write outside of your own identity discussions. Not necessarily that. It's just that oftentimes a lot of, for example, LGBTQ+ writers aren't really out to their families or to their friends. And so if we necessarily apply that one lens that if this person is straight, they can't write gay couples, again, we shouldn't be speculating about the writer's identity, especially because of the nature of lived reality. So again, ultimately I feel like in terms of is it a good portrayal, is it not, is it nuanced, the work will speak for itself, and that is ultimately the only thing we can and for the most part will be able to look at in regards to that kind of estimation. In regards to how to write characters that are not one or two-dimensional and only have their marginalization as their main characteristic, if I understood the question right. I believe that ultimately goes back to your own ethos of how you write characters and how you view marginalized people as people, right? Marginalizations, your various sections of identity are, of course, part of it, but your personality isn't gay. Like, that's not the entirety of who you are. Just like any other character you would write, the entirety of their personality isn't just one thing. So again, ultimately, for me, it goes back to, you see these people as people. You see them as 3D people who are multiple identities, entire universes in every people, in every person, as writers have said. So yeah, for me it goes back to how do you view them as people, and how do you write characters and view those characters as fully fleshed out people as well. Thank you.
Hello. There. Right, so I just wanted to speak, and this with regard to the first question, just because obviously I'm not aware, right? I don't have time for it. But yeah, I guess speaking in terms of the intentionality behind serving, I suppose, cultural products in this sense, I'm trying to question the utility of thinking about the importance of intent. And this is not to contribute to capitalistic hegemonic forces, right? But it's really more about, at the end of the day, what are these things supposed to do anyways, right? Because at least if you think about, I suppose, like, for example, like a queer movie, right? At the end of the day, it's supposed to make money, right? So at least thinking of it in terms of the creator's intent, I think it does have its limits in that sense. Yeah, but I suppose there is something to be said about also, at least with regard to queer baiting and things within that spectrum, right? I suppose my question more has to do with, we're putting so much pressure on certain media or, again, cultural products to represent our community, when in fact I think we should be directing the pressure on maybe industries to produce more, right? Because clearly having one or two representation, we can only represent so much, right? But actually having a plethora of options does, in a way, it does lessen the burden, right? For certain movies or other kinds of media to represent correctly or not queer-baiting, things of the sort. So I think that's my thought on that.
Yes.
Hi, Christine. Thanks for your presentations. I enjoyed listening to them. I have two questions, if that's all right. But I'm going to point. So I have two questions. One is for Angeli and one is for Christian. For Angeli, in your talk earlier, you suggested that these anthologies construct malasakit as something that is embedded in community care, and you kind of distinguish this construction of malasakit as opposed to more state-based formations. I was just wondering how that distinction holds up to the fact that malasakit as a discourse has been significantly co-opted by not only the Duterte regime but also, more right-wing factions now. We remember the slogans of Tapang at Malasakit as a political value. So I was just wondering how you consider that factor in your discussion of Malasakit in these anthologies. And I'm also curious if the stories in these anthologies very deliberately counteract or interrogate that co-optation of Malasakit by the state. Meaning by Angeli. And if I may, another question for Christian. Earlier you said that the Nero Randis translate an ethics of hope into a spatial tactic. And I'm curious about your use of the word spatial, especially in relation to your primarily digital mode of ethnography. I remember that your objects of study were hashtags and ganon. So when you use the word spatial, referring to these place-based rallies, I was wondering how this tactic of spatiality, especially what you called earlier as enacting utopia in the here and now. So it's very embedded in a particular temporal and physical setting. I wonder how that notion of spatiality on the one hand is or relates to your field of research, or which is the space. I don't think it can be called the space or the sphere of the digital. So one is very embedded in a specific temporal and physical settings, and the space of the digital is a lot more fluid. So I wonder how the spatial metaphor kind of bridges these two fields of inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that question. I wasn't able to really interrogate Manasaki in this presentation specifically because 15 minutes. But in the actual paper itself, I talked about several case studies where Manasaki is used, not just there, but the specific word Manasaki. So I mentioned earlier, Bongo has Manasaki centers, which was a partisan tool political campaign for him. San Miguel Corporation, it also uses Manasakit as its core feature, whatever, but obviously they're involved in so much development aggression, they're involved in community displacement of urban poor communities and fishermen communities. They even talked about Manasakit in the context of the New Manila International Airport happening in Bulacan, which is not only destroying the environment, but destroying communities and people. Aside from that, PLDT also uses Manasakit as a framework for their charity services, but when you dig in deep, they have so many labor violations. This discourse of co-optation is interesting to me because how can corporations and even the state, which has killed so many people, claim to care about others or claim to care about the future and the world? So in tackling that question, I think we have to take them at their word. What does it mean for them to care? And in this, I think for them to care about us is for them to own us. It's not for us to belong to each other, to belong to the world. It's for them, these corporations, to own our imaginations, our future, own the way that we relate to each other. So it's very much a elite capture. I also think what the value of bringing back Malasakit and more broadly notions of care, empathy, compassion within sort of more progressive movements within political analysis is that caregiving will never leave the public domain. It will always be recognized. It will always be used to either advance political interests, fascist interests, or to relegate caregiving to the domestic sphere, where women are underpaid, overworked, slave-like conditions, etc. So if we don't claim or try to reclaim care and more broadly Malasakit, all these various terms for care, the state and other corporations will do it for us. So that's the value I find in sort of bringing it back within the sphere of belonging and a sphere of seeing each other as seeing one another in a community that wants better for the world in the future. In the women's narratives, they don't precisely talk about care in those terms. But they do contrast. It's interesting because the way these narratives are constructed structurally, they talk about like this broad picture of what's happening during the pandemic. So they talk about killings, they talk about the lack of financial aid, they talk about militarization. And then the next paragraph, they talk about going to their Zumba lesson. So when I was reading this for the first time, I was really sort of bamboozled because I was like, how do you grapple with this? But I saw it as an act of reclaiming within the domestic sphere a sense of what it meant to take care of oneself in relation to others. So obviously I don't need to say that this is revolutionary. I don't think it is the revolution we need, but I think it's an important step in thinking about how we imagine another world where we want to live in, right? So it's not just a world where, definitely we want to overthrow the unequal distribution of wealth, we want to overthrow oligarchs, etc. But more than that, I think it's important to mention also to say that also we want to build something up, not just tear something down. So, yeah, going back to my central point, if we don't reclaim care as something we do for each other, as a practice for building another world, a better world, then all these other big, powerful, terrible institutions will do it for us.
Hello? There. Right. Okay. So, so at least with regard to the first question with regard to spatiality, at least the way I approach it, or at least the way we approach it in semiotic landscape, is that space is not given. It is semiotically created or semiotically performed. So at least in this particular case, the way I look at, or the way I think about Lenny's campaign rallies as being a kind of space is largely it's emergent from different kinds of science, as we see like in campaign materials, presence of people, practices. So the convergence of these things is what makes space possible. So that is how I also incorporate this idea of ethos of hope, being a kind of spatial tactic in the sense that it's very much embedded in a kind of discourses that are circulated and that proliferate within this agglomeration of different things or different elements, right? And then at least with regard to reconciling my position as someone who was largely an outsider looking in, well, first thing is there were travel restrictions during the time, so as much as I would have liked to participate and be there in the field or in the ground, that was a very much that was a very real hindrance or constraint that I had to grapple with, or at least I think many of us had to grapple with, for people who have to do field work. So that was one of the things that was like informed my orientation with regard to being online and the space largely being being material, right? But at the same time, I suppose I'd like to refer to the late social linguist Youngblood, because he does make it explicit that it's actually quite dangerous to think dichotomously about online spaces and material spaces, in the sense that much of our online interactions, or much the way of how we carry out the things that we do in online spaces, are very much grounded in material, in the material world, right? I mean, you can't reply to someone on Twitter or X, what have you, but if you're not in the real world typing on your phone, right? So these kinds of dichotomization, thinking about space as purely online and purely material, is, in a way, we have to think more of it as a kind of nexus, that they do converge at certain points, at certain moments. So at least that is how I reconcile, how I approach a very material, physical campaign rally, and how I approach it largely through an online means. Yeah, and I suppose just to add to that, as we can see, even in the examples, right, there's a clear flow, right, of online discourses permeating the material landscape. Right? So for example, like X for learning, like teachers for learning, bottoms for learning, right? And these things did not only happen in the material environment, right? This would take on some investigation, but I'm pretty sure these are things that carry over, right, from things that were circulated online, right? And I suppose just to extend to that, even with, I guess like another tangible instance of this would be what do you call this? Oh my gosh. Aus Duterte. Right? It was during the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, it was largely online discourses. But these kinds of discourses found their way in the material landscape. So again, I would highlight that, again, I don't want to think about these two spaces as being isolated from each other, but rather they inform each other. If that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, so that would be my response to that, sorry.
Thank you, Christian. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Nelson and then. Sige, baka you want to ask them 2 questions? Yeah, yeah. Maybe we can extend just a little bit because we started late anyway.
Hello, I'm Nelson. First, thank you for all of your insightful presentations. My questions are for Christian and Angeli. So, apologies for the repetition, but for Christian, what I find interesting in the semiotic landscape of linear operetta is that it resists populism, but at the same time, it resembles populism. And by populism, what I mean is populism as performance. You're constructing this virtuous ones and this dangerous or problematic others. I guess my question goes like, how do you navigate these tensions in analyzing that semitic landscape? And then for Angeli, this may not be part of your presentation, but perhaps a potential opening. I love how you use malasakit as a framework to, in the context of emergent social movements. I guess my question is, how does malasakit overlap with socio-economic class? Because one may argue that to have malasakit, to share is to have something. And so I guess in the journal articles that you have analyzed, does that sort of variable transpire? And if having socio-economic resources lack, what's the alternative provided, constructed, created by that sort of emergent social? That's it. Thank you so much.
Then maybe we can have this question.
Hi, lovely presentation as well. I'm Andrew, I'm the DECL. My question is for Ian. So I'm just curious to know, you said something earlier about the external government, especially contemporary external government, not really acknowledging their role in the atrocities they had that happened with the Australian Aboriginal community. So I'm just curious to know how did contemporary external writers respond to that silence from the government? Because you said something also about literature basically doing its part essentially to address this absence, this lack of response from the officials from the state, basically. So I'm just curious to know what exactly, how did exactly these writers respond to that silence? That's it. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, so I'll just briefly answer Nelson's question. I want to actually discuss this with you at some point in the future. Yeah, we can talk about this more. But yeah, I was thinking about, I suppose we can disagree. I think we can all agree, right? I think we can all agree that, at least in this particular case, yeah, it does resemble populism in a sense, right? Although I suppose just to, in a way, kind of decontextualize it a little bit, I mean, when has Philippine elections never been populist in English? Right? But I suppose what's worth thinking about is the kind of populism that took form during the elections. Right? Because at least in this particular case, I was very much, I was clearly highlighting how macho populism was quite a prevalent political policy, political kind of conduct or structure in our society, right? But at the same time, I suppose the kind of populism, or an alternative kind of populism that Guerrero generated, right? I'm pretty sure it's a lot less, how do you say this, oppressive in a way, right? In the sense that, yeah, in the sense that there are certain leanings towards ideas of inclusion, right, or honesty and things of these kinds of ideas. So in terms of them being both populist, yes, I would say kind of yes. But at the same time, I think it would be redundant to think about these as being purely like siblings of populism, right? Because clearly they're very different. And so I think that's how I would go about navigating that tension.
Thank you so much, Nelson, for your question. In terms of journal articles, actually there really is kind of nothing written on malasakit in the Philippines. Michael Tan just talks about it in the context of, he says in one line, it's literally to share another's pain. So I really appreciate what you brought up about the socio-economic material conditions of people. I think that I don't agree with the framing that malasakit should be seen as an act of charity or an act of just giving. I see it as a broader sort of political being with others. I refer to this sort of, 15 minutes, it was cut short, but I'm thinking of the words as it talks about the shared burdens of illness. And actually a number of scholars talk about health and illness as not biological per se, but seeing health as a condition of being able to work under capitalism. So he said, actually, you can think of yourself, we can think of all of us as we are all sick under capitalism. So that shared sickness is something very fascinating to me. And what I feel like what was explored, particularly in the narratives, was not actually giving. There was a giving, and I think that was highlighted in the excerpt that I chose. But a lot of it was choosing to be with others, and choosing to see themselves as connected to others who they didn't see themselves as connected to before. So suddenly they felt like they had a stake in the struggles of the urban poor, the struggles of farmers, which for me is just a huge shift in the imagination. So I'm thinking of it like that, but I don't want it to be confined to just like imaginative and effective. Materially, I think it means protesting for better social services. I think it means asking for justice for all the activists and all the farmers and all the leaders who have been killed under Marcos Duterte and other presidents. I don't think practicing care, or more broadly practicing malasakit, means you have to give something materially to someone else. It can be as simple as joining a strike, joining a protest, putting more bodies on the street when we need more bodies on the street, to tell the government, you're fucked and we deserve better. So seeing that practice of being with each other as not something definitely tied to material, but something that can also coexist with it in ways that doesn't limit the way we live with each other. Thank you for your question, Nasa.
So, Andrew, right? Take the question. Yeah. So we have these ideas of post-colonialism as maybe being the end of colonization. But when it comes to Aboriginal writers, while most post-colonial scholars who argue that Australia is included in the field of post-colonialism, this is merely through the vantage of them being a settler colony, and it doesn't accommodate the viewpoints of the Aboriginal people. And Aboriginal writers themselves would even go as far as to claim that Australia is a post-colonizing nation, given the reluctance to afford these Aboriginal people with their land or the rights that they have. So when we contended, part of what I wasn't able to mention in my study was really arguing what post-colonialism means. When we study it, do we view it as merely all the effects of colonialism, or how do we distance ourselves from it? And Nathaniel O'Reilly even points out, though, that while Australian literature is post-colonial, Australian society isn't. So there are those factors also that we must consider given the writers, Aboriginal writers as well. So yeah, basically that's it. Hope this answers your question. So.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Vic.
Hello, thank you. I'm Vic from the Department of English and Comparative Literature. So this question is for Ian, because my research interest is in religion and literature. So what fascinated me most about the presentation was the Aboriginal spirituality of dreaming. So my question is, as scholars, is it possible for us to understand the indigenous spirituality not only as contrasting with colonial power and knowledge, not only as an object of study, but as a deeply lived reality, as embodied by people, as something, felt deep in the spirit, deep in the bones, encompassing the whole universe? Or is there really a limit to academic ways of knowing that there's really, that deep embodied aspect of spirituality, original spirituality, you really can't touch it with a scholarly approach?
Thank you for that question. Actually, again, part of what I wasn't able to discuss was the miseducation and the misconstruction of dreaming. So most anthropologists, Australian anthropologists, used it sort of as a novelty to market off to other academics. So what they lacked was really engagement, a deep engagement into what the dreaming is. And while I think we can only approach it, but we can never really grasp what it means as, since we are outsiders, we aren't really part of what, we really aren't part of Australia or the Aboriginal people. But again, I think if we're afforded the experience, maybe visiting those communities, seeing how they interact with each other, sort of getting a feel of what the dreaming is to them, or the dreaming that isn't as described by the English language or through their language, then maybe we could really approach it earnestly, sincerely. Yeah, but yeah.
Alright, I think we still have a little bit more time for maybe 2 more questions. Pero ang dami ko gusto ko mabot. Sige, Nika,
Okay. Also, my question is directed to Christian. So, I'm Nico. I'm interested in semiotic landscapes as well. So, my question is, were you able to consider like other semiotic elements in the landscape? Because in your presentation, it mainly gives an example of placards and everything. So my understanding of semiotics is that it also takes into account images, music, and stuff like that. So I'm guessing you were able to account for that.
Hello? There. Right. So yes, yeah, I actually considered other semiotic elements. I should have, at least in the interest of time, in terms of presentations, right? It's actually much more straightforward to present an analysis of language rather than talk about. I did touch a little bit on color, right? At least with regard to the use of recurrent use of pink. Yeah, but yeah, the thing is, at least with regard to how I approach this particular campaign, it's actually, at least the science that I studied, it's actually a part of like a broader thing that actually not just me, but also Andrew focused on. Largely because initially we were interested in the use of K-pop as signifiers that were used in the campaign. Largely because, in addition to Lenny, there was a lot, at least online, there was a huge K-pop contingent, right? And in that particular case, it was not just language that was important, right? Use of light sticks, photo cards, what do you call this? I can't remember what the correct term is. The random dance plays. Yeah, so these things were very much integral into how these kinds of different kinds of positive affects actually circulated within the landscape. So yeah, so at least it was just largely because of convenience. That's why it was largely limited to more visual elements. Yeah, so thank you.
thank you for your generosity. Do we have last minute questions? Hindi kayo makakatulog unless Sige, we have one more, and then this is the last.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I was very interested in all of your presentations. I want to ask this question to Ian in particular. So you talked a lot about center colonialism, so I was just wondering, given the landscape of Australia now and the influx of migrants from countries like the Philippines, how do these narratives from migrants who then settle but also occupy quite an oppressed and unequal position in Australian society, how do they figure into the interplay or the narrative landscape of the indigenous narratives in Australia?
Hello. Yeah, thank you for that question. Actually, upon really integrating or really going into the thick of Australian literature, it's quite actually a problematic field of study because Australians don't read Australians. So even you won't find much Australian studies courses or degree programs in Australia. It's a highly specialized field and it's mostly dominated by those white voices, white writers. So when we come to thinking about Australian literature, where the immigrants factor in, where the Aboriginal people factor in, again, I think it points to what Graham Huggan calls a transnational post-colonial reading of the text or of the whole body, which decentralizes the field of mostly white Europeans and actually accommodating the voices of different ethnicities. But again, the current issue in the academy of how Australians study Australians is that a specialized view or a specialized or a narrow field of Australian studies has been relegated to a more inclusive global studies or cultural studies degree programs that maybe touch on these things but don't really key into them and key into the transformations in which Australian literature is today. So,
Christian, Sydney, and Ian to our very engaged audience. And with that, we conclude the first and hopefully not the last DECL Youngblood Roundtable. So thank you once again for coming and happy anniversary to the College of Arts.